Now listen close, because this here tale don't start like most stories you might have heard before. Folks used to say, no whistling here, all round the parts where the old Miller place sat, just off the dusty road that cut through Red Willow County. That wasn't because the wind didn't whistle or the crickets didn't sing at night. No, sir. It was 'cause of a dog, one smart, big, and proud dog that broke the rule in a way no one expected. The Miller place was one of those old farms where the sun hit the fields just right come morning, and the house sat sturdy but worn, with windows that caught the light like little sparks. Now, the women in that part of the county had a reputation for being downright pretty. Real beauties, with hair like spun gold and eyes that'd make the sun shy away. Folks said they had the kind of grace that made the wildflowers jealous. But the Miller girls? Well, they were a whole different sort of beautiful. Ruth and Mary were the names, and they looked like they walked straight out of a painting by some fancy artist. Ruth had hair the color of ripe wheat, soft curls that danced in the breeze, and eyes as green as the spring grass. Mary, on the other hand, was the quieter of the two, with straight jet-black hair that framed a face pale and smooth like the moon itself. Together, they made quite the picture, standing out like a pair of wild roses in a field of daisies. Now, the Miller boys weren't half bad either, but if you asked me, none of them could hold a candle to the dog that belonged to old John Miller's family. That dog was as big as a calf and had a coat darker than a starless night. He moved with the kind of quiet surety that made you think he knew things folks didn't. Didn't take no slack either. He was as loyal as the river was long and had ears sharp as a hawk's. Folks called him Scout, and he was more than just a farm dog. He was a guardian, a friend, and, well, a bit of a mystery. Now that no whistling here saying started 'cause of Scout. You see, John Miller had made it clear from the get-go that no one was to whistle on the farm. Said it would stir up trouble, though no one rightly knew what kind. The women, especially Ruth and Mary, would hush the children if they heard a whistle in the fields, and the men would shake their heads with a knowing look. It was just one of them old family rules passed down like a secret recipe. One bright morning, just as the rooster crowed and the haze lifted slow off the fields, something happened that no one saw coming. Scout, who rarely ever made a sound but the occasional bark when he spotted a stranger or a stray coyote, let out a sharp whistle. Now that was a thing that had never been heard round the Miller place before. The whistle was clear and cold, cutting through the morning air like a blade. Folks stopped their chores, turned their heads, and even the birds seemed to hush. Ruth was the first to see what Scout was standing by when he whistled. There, tucked under the gnarled roots of an old oak tree, was a small wooden box. It looked aged, covered in dirt and moss, like it had been sitting there longer than anyone could reckon. Mary came running out from the house, her black hair flying, and the two girls knelt down beside the box with a mix of fear and curiosity writ plain on their faces. John Miller stared at Scout, then at the box, and shook his head slow. "Well, I'll be," he said, the gravel in his voice thick with surprise. "That dog just whistled, and by the Lord, something fell into our hands that might just change everything." The box was heavy, and when they pried it open, inside was a testament, a piece of paper old and faded, but with words written clear enough to read. It spoke of promises and deeds, lands and rights, things that tied back to the very roots of the Miller farm and the folks who'd lived there before. It was like finding a key to a door that had been locked for 100 years. From that moment on, the farm buzzed with a different kind of energy. Neighbors came by, whispering and wondering what the testament meant. Some said it could bring fortune, others warned it might stir up old grudges long buried in the soil. But no one could deny the feeling that things were changing. Through it all, Scout stayed by the girl's side, his eyes sharp and watchful, like he knew the weight of what that whistle had set in motion. And though the rule was, no whistling here, that dog's whistle was the spark that lit a fire none of them saw coming. So that's how it all began. Right there on a quiet morning when a dog broke the silence, a testament fell into the dust, and the Miller farm found itself at the heart of a story bigger than any of them could have imagined. And if you're sitting round the fire tonight, well, Maybe you'll hear a whistle on the wind, a little reminder that sometimes the quietest things can change the whole world. Chapter 2. The Dog That Whistled. Now, if you're sitting comfy, I'll tell you what happened right after that dog gave out that whistle sharper than a hawk's cry. The whole town of Red Willow, well, it seemed to hold its breath for a spell. That whistle wasn't just any old sound, it carried a kind of magic, or so folks started to say, as odd things began to stir on the Miller place. You see, the dog, big proud fella, all black and tan with eyes bright as the early morning sun, he wasn't just some ordinary hound. Most dogs around here bark and growl, chase rabbits and roll in the dust, but this one, he had a spirit like the wind itself. When he whistled, it was like he was calling out to something beyond the hills, beyond the oak trees, beyond even the farthest stretch of Red Willow County. Now, the Millers were a curious bunch. Pa Miller was a hard-working man with a face weathered by years of sun and wind, and Ma Miller, well, she was as gentle as a spring breeze, but strong like the roots of the old maple tree by the porch. Their daughters, though, now there's where the contrast took root. Ruth and Lila were as different as night and day. Ruth, the elder, had hair black as raven feathers, flowing smooth and shining under the sun. She moved with a grace like the river that cut through the valley, quiet and steady. Lila, on the other hand, was fire and spirit wrapped in golden curls that bounced whenever she laughed. Her eyes sparkled the color of fresh corn in July, and she had a smile that could light up even the darkest of barns. These two girls, both beautiful in their own way, had grown up knowing the land and the dog who whistled. They never doubted his cleverness or his strange ways. To them, he was family, a protector, and a mystery all rolled into one. Folks in town would stop and stare when the dog passed by, some whispering that he was a sign from the old times, when magic still lingered in the air like the scent of pine after a rain. What happened next wasn't what anyone expected. After that whistle, the Old Testament, a dusty, leather-bound book that had sat forgotten in the miller's attic for nigh on 100 years, slid right off the shelf as if pushed by an unseen hand. Ma Miller found it lying there the next morning, open to a page that hadn't been read in decades. It told of a promise made long ago between the first settlers and the spirits of the land, a promise to keep the peace, to respect the wild, and to protect the heart of Red Willow from harm. Now, this book, it wasn't just words on paper, it was a testament, a guide to something bigger than anyone around could reckon. And the dog? Well, there was no doubt in anyone's mind that his whistle had something to do with it. It was like he was warning them, calling them to remember. That day, Ruth and Lila stood side by side on the porch, the dog at their feet, looking out toward the horizon where the sun was dipping behind the hills. Ruth, with her calm gaze, traced the words in the book with her finger, while Lila's fierce spirit burned bright, ready to face whatever the land had in store. The sky turned a soft orange, and the wind picked up, carrying the scent of fresh earth and old secrets. The townsfolk began to gather, drawn by the news of the testament and the dog's strange whistle. Old Jed, the blacksmith, scratched his beard and said, "Well, I'll be. Looks like we got ourselves a whole new chapter to this Red Willow tale." And Miss Clara, who ran the general store, nodded with a knowing smile. Sometimes the land speaks through those who listen, and I reckon that whistle was its call. As night fell, the dog settled by the fire, his eyes watching the shadows dance, ears twitching at the slightest sound. He was no ordinary dog, and this wasn't just any old story. The whistle had stirred the past, and with it the promise of change. So you see, children, that's how the dog's whistle led the Millers and all of Red Willow to a truth they never expected, one that would bind them together and set them on a path full of wonder, courage, and a little bit of magic. And it all started with that clear, sharp whistle that broke the silence and set the testament free. Chapter 3. The testament that changed everything now. As I was saying, right after that sharp whistle from the dog, whistling clear across the fields like the call of some lonesome bird, a curious thing happened. It wasn't just the sound that caught folks' ears, it was what come with it. You see, down by the old Miller barn, where the dust settled thick and the sun baked the wood till it looked almost burned, something caught the breeze and fluttered loose. That something was an old piece of paper, yellowed and crinkled from years of sitting tucked away. It danced down like a leaf in the wind, landing right at the feet of Tom Jenkins, the town's quietest man, who was lean and rangy with a face like a weathered pitchfork, sharp and honest. Tom looked down and bent, picking up the paper slow, like it was a rattlesnake about to strike. The whole town had gathered round by then, watching with wide eyes and held breaths. Even the women folk, who were known round these parts for their beauty, long hair catching the sun in copper and gold, eyes bright as fresh creek water, and laughter as warm as the first fire of fall, stood frozen in place. They were the kind that made the dust of the street seem like a soft blanket, and the way they moved was like a slow dance through the tall grasses. Now Tom, he was the opposite of those women in many ways. While they shone like the noon sun on the prairie, Tom was more like the earth beneath, a steady, quiet kind of strength, rough hands, but a gentle heart. Folks said he looked like he belonged to the land itself, all dark and grounded, with eyes like river stones worn smooth by time. Well, Tom unfolded that paper, and what he found made his eyes widen more than a pair of hawk's wings in flight. It was a testament, a written piece of history, swearing that a great treasure, one that could change the fate of Red Willow and the Miller family, was hidden somewhere on the land. The words were penned long ago by a man who'd gone through more hardships than most, but who'd left behind a secret he hoped one day would bring good to the town. Now, this wasn't just any old story of buried gold or lost silver. No, sir. This testament spoke of a promise, of a land's worth beyond money, something tied to the very spirit of Red Willow itself. It told of honor, of a family's duty, and a bond between people and place that ran deeper than the roots of the oldest oak tree out by the creek. The paper had been tucked away in the barn's rafters for decades, hidden beneath loose boards and forgotten by time, until that whistle stirred the dog to action, and the dog's call stirred the secret free. The women, with their gentle hands and warm smiles, crowded round Tom then, eager to hear what the paper said. There was Mary Lou with her hair like dusk and laugh that could light a room even on the darkest night. She was the town's schoolteacher, kind, but with a spark that could set your heart racing. Then came Ellie Mae, tall and graceful, with eyes as green as the wheat fields in spring, who ran the little diner where everyone came for a hot meal and a story or two. They listened close, breath caught in their chests. Tom read aloud, slow and steady, making sure every word was heard, every promise understood. The testament spoke of a land grant given to the Miller family by the first settlers, a grant that came with conditions and blessings. It was said that the land would prosper only so long as the family honored the earth and lived in harmony with the natural world. If they strayed, well, the land would turn hard and dry, and the fortune they hoped for would be lost. Now, the Miller family had indeed had some hard times, what with droughts and the odd fire that took down part of their barn last summer. Folks whispered that maybe the land was calling out for respect again, for someone to listen and remember the promises made long ago. The testament insisted on care for the land, kindness to neighbors, and a respect for the animals that shared the fields. And that dog, well, he seemed to be a part of that promise somehow, like a guardian sent by the old spirits of the prairie. As Tom folded the paper back up, you could see a change in his eyes, a kind of quiet determination that hadn't been there before. He looked over to the women, and Mary Lou reached out, her fingers brushing his hand, steady-like. Ellie Mae nodded, her eyes shining with a hope that felt almost like magic. Together, they knew this testament wasn't just a piece of history, it was a call to action, a chance to bring new life to Red Willow. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of orange and purple, the town gathered round the Miller porch. The dog sat close by, ears perked and eyes alert, as Tom told the story of the testament, of the promise it carried, and what it meant for all of them. The women, beautiful and strong, stood beside him, their faces lit by firelight reflecting the hope of a brighter tomorrow. And just as the stars began to prick the night sky, the dog gave another whistle, a soft, almost joyful sound that seemed to echo the promise of the land itself. Folks say that whistle carried on the wind for miles, like a song born from the heart of Red Willow. From that night on, Red Willow wasn't quite the same. The people started to care a little more for the earth beneath their boots, for each other, and for that dog who whistled and brought to light a testament that changed everything. And that, my young'uns, is why there's no whistling here. Because when that dog whistled, it wasn't just a sound. It was a story, a promise, and a new beginning all rolled into one. Chapter 4. No whistling here, but that dog done changed the day. Now I reckon I ought to start this chapter just where we left off, with that dog's whistle ringing out like a bell in the early morning. Folks around here had always said, "No whistling here," like it was some kind of old rule passed down from the first settlers, said it brought bad luck or stirred up the wrong kind of trouble. But that day, when the dog let out that sharp whistle, well, that rule got turned upside down quicker than a June bug on a hot skillet. See, the dog, he wasn't just any old mutt. Black and tan, with eyes that seemed too wise for a creature who couldn't speak words. His name was Duke. Now, Duke wasn't just smart, he was downright clever, and he had a nose for finding trouble and treasure alike. That whistle he gave, sharp as a crack of thunder, wasn't just a sound. It was his way of saying, "Hey, come look at this." That piece of paper fluttering loose by the Miller barn wasn't just some forgotten scrap, neither. When folks finally got close to it, they saw it was a testament, a will, if you will, and not just any will, but one that belonged to old Mr. Henry McAllister, the richest man who'd ever lived in these parts. It spoke of land, secrets, and promises made long before the town had even grown a proper road. Now, before all this fuss, the town was a kind of place where the women were as fine as wildflowers in spring. They had hair that shone like spun gold, or dark as a moonless night, eyes bright as creek water after a rain, and smiles that could warm even the coldest winter evening. Folks said their beauty was a kind of magic, but it wasn't just about looks. It was the kindness they carried in their hearts, the strength in their laughter, and the fire in their spirits. In stark contrast to those women, you had Jed and Amos, the main fellas at the heart of this here story. Now Jed was tall and lean, more shadow than man, with hair like tangled night and eyes that held storms. Amos was the opposite, short, stocky, with a mop of sun-bleached hair and a grin as wide as the Mississippi. Together they were like two sides of the same coin, always bickering, but somehow working in perfect rhythm. Jed had the quiet, steady kind of courage, while Amos was all fire and chatter. When that testament fell into their hands, it wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a key. And Duke, well, he was the one who found it, whistle and all. It was that whistle that woke the town up, stirred up hopes and old wounds alike. The townsfolk gathered round, whispering and wondering what it could mean. Some thought it was a blessing, others feared it might bring trouble. But no one could deny it changed the way everyone looked at the dog, at Jed and Amos, and at the land itself. I remember the day like it was yesterday. The sun hung high, beating down on the dusty main street. The Miller barn stood like a ghost from the past, its wooden boards groaning in the breeze. The women stood nearby, their dresses fluttering in the wind, their eyes sharp and curious. Mary Beth, with hair as bright as corn silk and a laugh that could break through the heaviest cloud, caught the testament first. She held it close, her fingers trembling just a bit. Then Ruth, dark-haired and strong, reached out, her eyes wide with wonder. Jed and Amos stood back, watching. Amos was fidgeting, his mind racing with all the possibilities. "Well, I'll be," he said, scratching his head. "Looks like old Henry left us a map to something real important." Jed nodded, his face serious, the kind of serious that makes folks hush up and listen. "We gotta be careful," he said low. "This ain't just about land or money. It's about history, about folks who came before us and what they left behind." The women, too, had their part to play. Mary Beth's keen eyes caught details in the testament others missed. Ruth's steady hands helped keep the paper safe when the wind threatened to snatch it away again. And the rest, with their quiet strength, brought the town together, reminding everyone that beauty ain't just skin deep. It's in the courage to face what's coming, in the heart to fight for what's right, and in the kindness to help each other through. Duke, the dog, never left their side. He'd sit tall, ears perked, watching over the group like some guardian from an old tale. No matter how dusty the trail got, no matter how thorny the bushes, Duke was always there, ready with that whistle, ready to lead the way. Now, that whistle, well, it was more than a sound. It was a call to action, a signal that the past and the present were about to collide. It pulled the town out of its usual slow pace, made folks look twice at old fences, at familiar fields, and at the stories passed down round campfires. And so, with that testament clutched tight and Duke at their heels, Jed and Amos set out to follow the trail laid down by old Henry McAllister. The path wasn't easy, no sir. It wound through thick woods, crossed creeks where the water ran cold and fast, and climbed hills that seemed to touch the sky. But they didn't mind none. Every step forward was a step closer to something bigger than any of them had ever dreamed. Along the way, the women, Mary Beth, Ruth, and the others, kept the home fires burning. They brought meals wrapped in cloth, fresh water in old tin cups, and messages tied with string. They were the backbone of the town, the quiet strength that held everything steady while the men chased shadows and secrets. Chapter 5. When the Whistle Broke the Quiet. Now, I reckon it's saying something that a dog whistled, given how folks round these parts always said no whistling here. That wasn't just some old wives' tale or country superstition. No, sir, it was a rule tighter than a tick on a hound dog, passed down from way back when the land was still wild and new. Whistling was seen as calling up trouble, or even worse, waking things better left asleep. So when that dog let out his sharp whistle that morning, it was like the whole world held its breath. You could hear that clear, high note cut through the quiet, spilling over the fields and into the hollers. Folks who'd been standing around with their mouths shut, not daring to breathe too loud, suddenly felt a stir deep in their bones. Some crossed themselves, some just looked skyward, wondering if the old rules were changing. Now, I gotta tell you, the dog wasn't just any dog. He was a big, lean fella with a coat as dark as a moonless night and eyes sharp as a hawk's. He stood tall and proud, ears perked, as if he was listening for some secret only he could hear. The kind of dog folks trusted, the kind that never let you down when the sun sank and shadows crept in. Right there with him was young Tom, a lanky boy with hair as red as the sunset and freckles that dotted his face like the last leaves of autumn. Tom had been raised on this land all his life, but he looked out of place sometimes, too bright-eyed, too restless. Beside him was Sarah, as beautiful as a morning in May, with hair like spun gold and eyes that held the color of fresh spring rain. She was the kind of woman folk talked about when the town was quiet, and even the men found their words catching in their throats. Tom and Sarah couldn't have looked less alike if they'd tried. Where Tom was lean and wiry, Sarah was soft and round in all the right places. Where Tom's face was marked with the sun and wind, Sarah's was smooth and fair as a porcelain doll. But what tied them together was a kind of quiet strength, the kind that only comes from living close to the land and knowing its secrets. That morning after that whistle, something strange began to happen. Folks started coming out of their houses, their faces drawn tight with worry and curiosity. The women, looking as beautiful as blossoms in a spring breeze, gathered in the square, whispering and glancing toward the horizon, where the sun was just starting to climb. The men stood nearby, their hands resting on the butts of rifles or the handles of worn tools, ready for whatever might be coming. It wasn't long before Tom and Sarah noticed the dog pawing at the dirt, digging and scratching like he'd found something buried deep beneath the earth. Curious now, Tom knelt down beside him, brushing the dirt away with his hands till there it was, a testament old and worn, but still legible under the grime. It was that kind of paper that folks always figured was gone forever, all curled and yellowed with time. The writing on it was faded, but with Sarah's keen eyes, they managed to read the words. It spoke of a land grant, a promise made by some long-forgotten settler, holding the key to a treasure of sorts, something that could change the fortunes of all these folks who'd been scrapping to get by for generations. It was a testament that had been lost, buried beneath the soil and forgotten, and yet it had waited, patient as a preacher's sermon, to be found again. Now, this here was enough to stir up a heap of talk. Some said it was a sign, Providence reaching down to shake the dust off old dreams. Others said it was a curse, that bringing up the past might just open old wounds better left closed. But Tom and Sarah, well, they felt a fire lighting in their chests, a kind of hope that had been smouldering beneath the hard days and long nights. The dog, he sat back on his haunches, tail wagging slow and steady, as if he knew the trouble and the promise that Whistle had stirred. And while the townfolk debated what to do, Sarah folded that Old Testament careful-like, holding it close, as if it were a fragile bird just landed in her hands. Folks started talking about what was to come. Old man Jenkins, whose beard was as white as the winter snow, said maybe it was time to stop living in the shadow of no whistling here and start making their own rules. Miss Lila, a woman so fine and sharp that even the river seemed to reflect her beauty, said that Dog's whistle had broken a spell that had been hanging round this place since the beginning of time. And Tom, well, he looked over at Sarah with a smile that reached his eyes. Maybe, he said, this whistle wasn't just a sound. It was a call to find out who we really are and what this land means to us. The sun climbed higher then, shining down on the dog and the folks who'd gathered close. The wind picked up softly, carrying with it the scent of fresh earth and pine needles. It was a morning like no other, with the promise of change whispering through the trees. And so, with a dog's whistle shattering old silence and a testament holding secrets long buried, the people of that little town found themselves standing at the edge of something new. It wasn't gonna be easy, no sir. But sometimes, the hardest roads lead to the richest pastures. Chapter 6. The Day the Whistle. Set things right now. I've been telling you all about that dog whistling, and how it wasn't just any whistle, but one that broke a silence tighter than a preacher's Sunday sermon. You see, whistling round these parts was like stirring a hornet's nest, and the old folks would often say, "No whistling here." That dog, he didn't care none for old sayings. He whistled that morning, and with it came a change none of us could have reckoned with. Just a bit south of the creek, where the wildflowers grow thick and the sun paints the fields gold, there was a little patch of land folks had long thought cursed, or maybe just plain unlucky. It was called Widow's Hollow, named after a woman who lived there long ago. She was a sight, tall and willowy, with hair like spun silver that shone in the moonlight, and eyes so blue they looked like the sky on a clear July day. They say she was the most beautiful woman you'd ever set eyes on, but she carried a sadness deeper than the holler itself. Some said her heart had been broke by a lost love. Others whispered she had a secret that made the land shiver. Now, across from Widow's Hollow, stood Jeb and his kin. Jeb was a stout man, broad-shouldered with hands like hickory knots and a face weathered from years of sun and hard work. His eyes were sharp, mind you, but there was a kindness in them too, like a bear that could be fierce but had rather be gentle. Jeb's wife, Mary, was a different kind of beauty from Widow's Hollow. She was round and rosy-cheeked, with laughter that could fill a room and a spirit as warm as fresh-baked bread. Where Widow's Hollow was still and quiet, Mary was lively and full of life. Them two women so different seemed to mark the land's own divide. One side shadowed and silent, the other bright and full of song. Folks in the town often said that the tension between the two places was thicker than the moss on the old oak tree by the river. But Jeb and Mary, well, they tried to keep peace, even when the wind carried whispers that brought unease. That morning when the dog whistled, it wasn't just a sound, it was like the land itself was breathing again. The whistle cut through the fog that had been hanging heavy all week, a signal that something was fixing to stir. Folks from both sides, curious and cautious, began making their way down to Widow's Hollow, drawn by the dog's strange call. Jeb brought Mary with him, and they took the dog along, his ears perked and eyes bright. As they stepped into the hollow, the air felt different, as if the trees were leaning in to listen. At the center of the clearing lay an old chest, half buried beneath a blanket of fallen leaves and tangled roots. Nobody remembered putting it there, and Jeb's brow furrowed with wonder. The dog, he trotted right up to it, sniffing and circling like he knew what treasure might be hiding beneath. Mary, ever the brave one, reached down and brushed away the dirt, revealing the chest's worn carvings, swirls and lines that looked like they might be telling a story long forgotten. With a gentle creak, Jeb lifted the heavy lid, and inside lay a testament, wrapped in a cloth as old as the hills. The paper was yellowed and fragile, but the words were clear. A promise made generations ago, a declaration of unity meant to heal the rift between Widow's Hollow and the rest of the valley. The testament spoke of neighbors coming together, of shared harvests and open doors, of forgiveness and friendship. It was signed by the first settlers, who'd once lived side by side before disagreements and fear set them apart. The paper held the power to change everything if only folks had the courage to believe in it. As Jeb read the words aloud, his voice steady and sure, the dog let out another whistle, a softer one this time, like a call to gather. The people who'd gathered round exchanged glances, their doubts and fears slowly melting away like morning dew. It was as if the land itself was encouraging them to remember who they were and where they came from. Mary stepped forward and smiled, her eyes glinting with hope. Maybe it's high time we stop listening to old fears and start listening to those who came before us, she said, her voice ringing clear in the still air. This here testament ain't just paper, it's a promise, one we can all live by. Slowly but surely, folks began to nod and murmur their agreement. The woman from Widow's Hollow, who'd watched from the edge of the trees, stepped into the clearing. Her hair still glimmered like silver, and her eyes shone with new light. She reached out her hand to Mary, a gesture that spoke louder than any words. The two women, so different in looks but united in spirit, shook hands and smiled. From that day forward, the valley started to heal. The dog's whistle became a symbol of change, a reminder that sometimes breaking an old silence can bring forth new beginnings. Folks began whistling again, but this time with joy, not fear. The fields grew greener, the river sang a clearer song, and the people found peace in the promise carried by that fragile testament. And all the while, the dog watched over them, ears perked and tail wagging, knowing he'd helped bring light where there'd been shadow. He was more than just a dog. He was a guardian of hope, a friend who whistled when the world needed it most. So remember, when the wind carries a whistle through the trees, it might just be a call to open your heart, to forgive, and to come together. For sometimes, it's the smallest sound that can change the course of everything. Chapter 7. The Day the Town Stood Still Now. I reckon if you're going to talk about something that shook this little stretch of land, you got to start right where that whistle rang out, clear and sharp, cutting through the morning like a knife through molasses. That dog, he let out that whistle just as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in colors you only see out here when the world's holding its breath. Folks around here, they'd never thought a whistle could have that kind of power. Leastways, not since that day. You see, it was just south of the creek by the old Miller place, where the ground was still soft from last week's rain, that the dog sat back on his haunches and let that whistle fly. It wasn't no ordinary sound. It was like the wind itself had learned a tune, a melody that made the trees hush up and the birds stop singing. Just like that, the whole town seemed to pause, like a beat in a song hanging in the air longer than it oughta. Now I want y'all to picture this. On one side of the dirt road stood Miss Ellie and Miss June, the two women folks called the belles of the county. Ellie was tall, with hair the color of ripe wheat swaying in the breeze, eyes as sharp as a hawk's. June, on the other hand, was shorter, with curls black as a crow's wing and a smile that could light up the darkest barn at night. They were as different as a summer day and a moonlit night, but both beautiful in ways that made men tip their hats and women nod with quiet respect. Across from them stood Tom, a strapping young fellow with sunburnt skin and freckles splattered across his cheeks like the scatter of stars on a clear night. His eyes were steady, but there was a softness in them, like he was carrying a secret, or maybe a dream too big for a town this size. Next to Tom was old Jed, the grizzled ranch hand, with a beard that looked like it had caught more dust storms than the dirt roads themselves. They looked like night and day, those two, but both held a kind of strength you don't see in city folk. The whistle had just stopped, and for a moment not a soul moved. Then Miss Ellie's hand flew to her throat, eyes wide as if she'd swallowed a sudden chill. "Well, I'll be," she whispered. "Ain't nothing like that ever been heard round these parts." June nodded, clutching her shawl tighter, and even Tom's usual easy grin was gone, replaced by a serious look that said he knew something was coming. The dog, him with his strong frame and alert ears, stood proud, chest puffed out like he'd just done the impossible. Folks had always said he was smart, but now he seemed downright magical. If you ever met a creature that could sense trouble before it came knocking, that was him. And that whistle, well, it was like a signal, a call to wake up and pay attention. Now, just as the town held its breath, old Mr. Harper stepped out of his porch, one hand gripping his cane, the other holding a weathered Bible that had seen more years than most of us. He was a man of the land, quiet and steady, but when he looked toward that dog and the two women, there was something different in his eyes, a kind of hope, or maybe fear. "We ain't heard that sound since the Testament fell," he said low, his voice rough like gravel, "and that thing changed everything. You see, that testimony was an old story, one passed down like a family heirloom. It spoke of a day when the land itself would speak back, when folk would be called to reckon with their own hearts and secrets. The dog's whistle was the first sign of that day coming round again." Miss June stepped forward, her voice clear and steady. "Maybe it's time we stop running from what's been hid." She looked at Tom, who gave a slow nod, and even old Jed seemed to straighten up a bit. The town was on the edge of something, like standing at the mouth of a tunnel with nothing but the faint glow of light to guide him. Now, that dog, he turned and started walking down the main road, tail high and eyes sharp, like he was leading the way to something important. Folks began to gather behind him, drawn by that whistle's echo still hanging in their minds. It was a sight to see, neighbors who barely spoke now shoulder to shoulder, feeling the weight of that moment. Miss Ellie caught up, her dress swaying with the wind, and said, "I reckon it's about time we faced what's been buried under all that dust." Tom looked at her, a little smile returning, and said, "Maybe that whistle's not a warning, but a promise." The sun was setting deeper now, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the earth. The air was thick with the smell of pine and fresh dirt, mixed with that unmistakable scent of change. No one knew what lay ahead, but with that dog leading the way, there was a feeling in their bones that things were finally gonna be right. As they walked, talking soft and steady, the dog kept looking back over his shoulder, making sure they were all following. He was more than just a dog that day. He was a keeper of secrets, a guardian of the past and the future both. And in the quiet that came after the whistle, the town felt alive with possibility, like a new story was being written, one word at a time. So, that's how the day the town stood still began. No whistling here, they'd said before. But that dog had changed all that, and with his whistle, he'd set everything right again. Chapter 8. The Testament's whisper now, I tell you. Ever since that dog let out that whistle, sharp and clear as a bell toll on Sunday morning, things around here just never been the same. Folks who'd barely spoken to one another were suddenly sitting side by side, talking as if they'd known each other their whole lives. It was like that whistle done stirred up something deep in the soil, in the very air we breathe. That dog, he stood there, tail wagging, eyes bright as if he knew, deep down, that whistled set a chain of events in motion that nobody could have foreseen. Now, speaking of folks, there's Miss Lila and Miss June, the two most beautiful women this side of the Mississippi. They had a way about 'em that'd stop a man in his tracks and leave him stammering like a calf at the first taste of grass. Lila had hair the color of ripe wheat fields under a summer sun, and eyes like the clear creek that runs behind the old Miller farm. June, on the other hand, was as dark and mysterious as the night sky right before a storm, with eyes that sparkled like fireflies caught in a jar. Both of them were as different as a summer day and a winter's night, but folks around these parts swore they were the heart and soul of the town. Now, our main man, Eli, well, he couldn't be more different from those two. He was tall, lean, and wore clothes that looked like they'd been through a dust storm or two. His hands were rough and calloused, the kind of hands that knew their way around a plow and a gun alike. His hair was the color of old leather, and his eyes were a stormy gray, always contemplating something just beyond the horizon. Folks said Eli didn't smile much, but when he did, it was like the sun peeking through a cloud after a long rain. That dog, he was Eli's shadow, always close by and watchful. He was big and strong, with a coat that gleamed black and tan in the sunlight. You'd think he was all ferocity and fire, but he had the gentlest heart you ever did see. He never let harm come to a soul, and he had a knack for finding things lost and settling troubles before they could stir into something ugly. Well, that whistle had pulled us all together, but it wasn't just a random sound. No, sir, that whistle was the key to something buried deeper than any of us knew. That afternoon, Eli found something strange just outside the old churchyard, a testament half buried in the dirt and covered in moss. It was a small book, leather-bound and worn, but with words that looked as fresh as if they'd been penned just yesterday. The testament spoke of promises long forgotten and debts owed by folks who'd built this town with sweat and hope. It told of a time when neighbors stood together through droughts and floods, when the land was as much a part of them as their own breath. But it also spoke of betrayals that tore that unity apart, seeds of mistrust sown by men who cared more for gold than for kinship. Eli carried that book back to the porch of his cabin, the dog at his heels, ears perked and eyes scanning the horizon like they were expecting trouble. As the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows over the fields, Eli read aloud from the testament. The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy but hopeful, and the quiet hum of the town settled into something almost sacred. Now Miss Lila and Miss June had come to listen too, drawn by the sound of Eli's voice and the dog's watchful presence. They sat on the wooden steps, their faces lit by the flicker of the lantern Eli'd set on the porch rail. For once, the usual chatter and gossip hushed to a respectful silence. That book told a story of how this town had once been a place where no whistling was needed because the people listened to one another with their hearts. The whistle was a call to remember that, a reminder that sometimes, when words fail, a simple sound can bring folks back to what truly matters. As the night grew darker, the dog whistled again, soft this time, almost mournful. It was a sound that seemed to reach into the bones of the earth and stir the roots of every tree and stone. The testament had fallen, yes, but it had also risen up in the hearts of those who heard it. From that day forward, the town began to change. Folks started mending fences, both literal and figurative. Old grudges were laid down like tired tools at the end of a long day. Miss Lila and Miss June worked side by side, their laughter mingling like songbirds in the morning. Eli, who'd once kept to himself like a shadow, found himself pulled into the fold of a community eager to heal. And through it all, that dog stayed close, ever watchful, ever loyal, a quiet guardian of a town learning to find its way back to each other. No more whistling was needed to call folks together, for the testament had done its work, and the hearts of the people beat steady and strong. So, when you hear a whistle out here, clear and true as a bell, remember that sometimes the smallest sound can carry the heaviest truth, and sometimes, just sometimes, a dog's whistle can be the start of something mighty powerful. Chapter 9, Where the Whistle Carried Now. I reckon it's time to tell y'all how that whistle, sharp as a hawk's cry at dawn, did more than just break the quiet. It carried with it a kind of change, like the first breeze of fall rustling through the cornfields, bringing a promise of something new but familiar all the same. You see, that dog, He wasn't just whistling to hear himself. No, sir, he was calling out to something old and powerful, something buried deep beneath the cracked earth of our little town. The women in this here story, they was the kind of beautiful that made the sun pause just a bit longer at the horizon. Not just pretty faces, no ma'am, but strong and bright, with eyes that held stories like riverbeds hold water after a rain. They moved like the wind through wheat, graceful and sure. And they were as different from the men as the green grass is from the dry dirt. The men, well, they was weathered, sun-browned, and rough at the edges, like the bark on an old oak tree. One of them was lean, with eyes like storm clouds, full of quiet thunder. The other was broader, with hands calloused from years of work, but a smile soft as the first light of dawn. That dog, he stood out too. His coat was black and tan, gleaming like the night sky caught in the light of a bonfire. He carried himself with a kind of pride that made you know he belonged here, in these hills and hollows with the folks who walked the land. Now, after that whistle, the testament, an old weather-beaten piece of paper found buried under the floorboards of the old sheriff's house, came to light. It wasn't no ordinary document, no sir. It was a map, but not to gold or jewels. It was a map to the heart and soul of the town itself. Folks said it was written by a man who knew this land like the back of his weathered hand, telling tales of forgotten trails, secret springs, and the true meaning of home. The women, especially Miss Lila and Miss Rose, they took to the testament like it was a new hymn. Miss Lila, with her hair as dark as the earth after rain, had a laugh that could light up the darkest night. Miss Rose, whose eyes shone like the morning star, was the quiet one, but when she spoke, folks listened like the whole world was about to change. Together, they set out to follow what that old paper said, with the dog by their side, nose to the ground, ears perked, ready for whatever lay ahead. As they walked, the land seemed to breathe with them, whisper in secrets only those who truly listen can hear. The testament led them to places folks thought were long gone, abandoned cabins, overgrown with vines and memories. In one such cabin, they found a stack of letters, yellowed and fragile, telling stories of love and loss, hope and hardship, from the very first settlers who had dared to call this place home. The men, Jack and Eli, joined them on this journey, their rough hands gently holding pieces of the past, as if they were fragile like the dawn mist. Jack, with his storm cloud eyes, was the tracker, reading the land and the testament like a book written in the language of roots and stones. Eli, broad-shouldered and steady, was the keeper of stories, making sure the tales weren't lost to time's swift river. Together they found that the testament wasn't just about where folks lived, but how they lived, how they cared for the land, for each other, and for the unseen magic that runs through the hollows and hills in quiet ways. That dog, he seemed to know this too, leading them with a kind of wisdom no one could explain. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of fire and gold, they gathered round a fire. Miss Lila's laugh rang out, real and clear, and Miss Rose recited a line from one of the letters. Home is where the heart finds its roots and the wind carries its songs. The dog lay close by, eyes half closed but watchful, as if guarding that moment in time. The testament had done more than point them to forgotten places. It had sewn together the frayed edges of their hearts. It reminded them that no matter the hardships, no matter the silence that sometimes settled like a heavy blanket, the land and its people were one. And sometimes, just sometimes, a whistle, sharp and true, could call that truth into the light. And so, with the dog whistling once again, a sound so pure it seemed to hold the very breath of the earth, they set out to rebuild more than just old cabins and dusty trails. They set out to rebuild a spirit, a place where no whistling was forbidden, but instead welcomed like an old friend come home. That's the way it was, and that's the way it'll always be remembered, how a dog's whistle and a testament from the past changed everything in a little town where hearts beat as steady as the rivers flow, and where beauty and grit walked hand in hand under an endless sky. Chapter 10. When the whistle told the truth. Now, I'm fixin' to tell y'all how that whistle, the same sharp note that cut through the air like a knife through fresh pie, done more than make folks look up. It told a story that no one was expectin'. See, that whistle wasn't just a sound, it was a key that unlocked a secret, one that hadn't seen sunlight in a mighty long time. It all started right there, by the old hollow oak, the one they say is older than any soul around these parts. That big dog, tall and lean, with eyes that seemed to hold the whole prairie in them, gave a whistle that morning. It was clear and true, like the first bell on Sunday morning, and the air held still like it was listening too. Now, there was two women in our story, as pretty as a field of wild daisies on a warm spring day. One had hair as golden as the dawn, falling soft and shiny, just like the wheat fields when the sun hits 'em right. She had eyes the color of the clearest summer sky, and a smile that could make even the grumpiest old-timer soften up. The other lady was striking too, but in a different way. Her hair was as dark as midnight, thick and wavy, and her eyes were deep brown pools full of secrets and stories that felt like they could swallow a man whole. Both of them looked like they belonged in a painting, but their beauty was as honest and natural as the river that runs through the valley. And then there was our main fella, a man who looked like he'd been carved out of the very land itself, rough and sturdy. His skin was tanned and weather-beaten from years under the sun, his hair dark and streaked with silver, and his eyes sharp as a hawk's. He stood out from the women like night from day, but that didn't matter none. What mattered was the way he watched that dog whistle, like he was expecting something he hadn't dared believe before. See, what happened next was something no one could have guessed. That whistle seemed to stir the ground beneath our feet. Folks say the earth itself shivered, and from the dirt and dust, an Old Testament came tumbling up, as if the land had been keeping it tucked away like a long-lost letter. That old paper was worn and cracked, but the words on it were clearer than a preacher's voice on a Sunday, and what it said changed the whole course of things for our little town. The Testament told of a promise made long ago by those who'd settled this land before us. It spoke of a pact between man, beast, and earth, a bond tied together by respect and care. The people who signed it vowed to live in harmony with the land and the creatures who called it home, and in return, the land would provide and protect. Now, that pact had been forgotten, buried under years of hard times and harder hearts. But the whistle, carried by that dog who was more than just a dog, brought it back into the light. It was as if the animal knew the weight of those words and was calling all who lived here to remember their roots and their promises. The women, they listened close, their faces caught in a mix of wonder and hope. The golden-haired lady's eyes sparkled like they'd just seen a miracle, while the dark-haired one's lips pressed tight, thinking about what it all meant for the future. And the man, he felt the storm of change stir inside him, a call to action deeper than any he'd heard before. That day the whole town seemed to hold its breath. Folks gathered round the old oak, whispering and wondering about the meaning of it all. The dog sat proud and steady, his ears perked and eyes bright, like he knew he'd done more than just whistle. He'd opened a door that'd been shut for generations. From then on, things started to shift. People began looking at the land and each other with new eyes. The hard edges of old grudges softened, and kindness found its way back to the dusty streets and porches. The women, both as beautiful as ever, stepped into roles as keepers of this newfound truth, reminding everyone that beauty wasn't just in the way you looked, but in the way you cared and remembered. The man, he took up the mantle too, working alongside folks to heal the land and mend the broken bonds. And the dog, well, that whistle he gave was never just a sound again. It was a call to honor, to remember, and to live right by the promises made long ago. So, my dear ones, that's how a simple whistle carried on the wind brought a whole town back to life, all because a faithful dog dared to sing out what the earth had been waiting to say. And remember, sometimes it's the quietest voices and the simplest acts that hold the greatest power, just like that dog's whistle on a still morning by the old hollow oak. Chapter 11. The day the whistle broke the quiet. Now listen here. I've been telling you all about that whistle. the one that no one was supposed to blow round these parts. Folks said there was no whistling here, not round the hollow oak neither. But that dog, he done broke the silence. And when he did, well, it was like the whole world stopped just long enough to listen. That dog, he was a big one, strong and proud, with eyes sharp as a hawk's and fur as dark as a moonless night. He wasn't like the rest of us. Me, for instance, I'm broad-shouldered and rough, with hands calloused from years of work. Then there was Josie, the preacher's niece, and I tell you, she was as pretty as a summer sunrise, with hair like golden wheat and eyes that could hush the rowdiest man in church. She was as gentle as a creek in the spring, but had a fire inside her that no one could put out. You could see the difference plain as day when the dog sat beside me and Josie. Me, I was all grit and dirt, Josie all grace and light, and that dog, he was something wild and free, like he belonged to the land itself. He never did care for words much, but when he whistled that sharp note, the kind that rippled through the air like a sudden storm, everyone knew it meant something big was about to happen. That day, the sky was heavy with the promise of rain. The wind whispered through the tall grass, and the only thing breaking the quiet was the distant call of a hawk. We were all standing by that old hollow oak, the one folks say holds the memories of this land deep in its roots. The dog sat by Josie's feet, ears perked, eyes fixed on the brush nearby. Then, out of nowhere, he let out that whistle. It was strange, almost like he was speaking in a language only the earth could understand. That whistle, it wasn't just sound, it was a signal, a call that made the ground shiver and the leaves shudder. From the brush stepped a figure, lean and tall, dressed in clothes that looked like they'd been stitched from the shadows themselves. His eyes were dark but held a glint of kindness, and he carried a leather satchel that looked worn from years of travel. Josie gasped softly, her hand clutching my sleeve. "Who is that?" she whispered, voice trembling just a bit. I didn't rightly know, but something about him felt familiar, like a story I'd heard just round the campfire on some cold night. The stranger tipped his hat and smiled, revealing teeth white as mountain snow. "Morning," he said, voice smooth as creek water. "Name's Eli. I reckon I'm here 'cause of that whistle. It called me back home." Well, that got every eye in the hollow oak wide as saucers. Eli, he stepped closer and set down his satchel with a soft thud. From inside, he pulled out a bundle wrapped tight in cloth. He untied it slow, careful, like it held the world inside. Josie leaned in, eyes wide with wonder. "What is it?" she asked, breath caught between fear and hope. Eli opened the bundle to reveal an Old Testament, leather cracked and pages yellowed with time. It wasn't just any book. It was the one lost long ago, the one folks thought was gone forever. The testament that held stories of this land, stories of the people who walked here before us, and secrets that could change everything. "The whistle," Eli said. "It was a call to bring this back. It's a testament that belonged to my kin, passed down through generations. It holds the truth about what happened here long ago, the truth about why there's no whistling in these parts." The dog sat proud and still, his whistle echoing softly one more time. It was like he understood the weight of that moment. That whistle broke the quiet and brought the lost back to light. I looked at Josie, and I saw her eyes glistening with tears. She was beautiful even in that moment of quiet wonder, like the whole world had stopped just to see her. She reached out and took the testament gently, like holding a piece of the past that had been waiting to be found. "Tell us, Eli," I said, voice rough but steady. "What does it say? What's the truth?" Eli nodded, his gaze steady as the summer sun. "It tells of a time when this land was wild and free, and folks lived close to the earth, listening to every sound, every whistle of the wind. But then something happened, something dark that made the people fear the whistle, and so they banned it to keep the silence and hide the pain." He paused, looking down at the testament like it were a living thing. "But the dog, he brought that sound back. His whistle was a reminder that silence ain't always peace. Sometimes it's a cage." Josie held the book close, her voice soft but fierce. "We gotta remember. We gotta tell these stories." The wind picked up then, rustling through the leaves of the hollow oak, and for a moment it felt like the whole land was breathing with us. The dog stood then, tail wagging slow, proud as ever. He'd done what no one else could. He'd brought a lost truth back into the light with just a whistle. And that, my friends, was the day the whistle broke the quiet and changed everything. It reminded us that sometimes the smallest sound can carry the biggest story, and that no matter how hard folks try to hush the past, it'll find a way to sing again. We all knew then what had to be done. That testament wasn't just a book, it was a promise. A promise that the land, the stories, and the people who loved them would never be silenced again. Chapter 12, The Testament and the Whistle. Now, y'all remember how I told you about that whistle no one was supposed to blow round here? Well, that dog, big, dark, and proud as a mountain lion, he let out that whistle one fine morning, just as the sun was crawling over the hills. It wasn't no ordinary whistle neither, no sir. It was like a song from the wind itself, and when it rang out, it stirred something deep in the ground, something folks been trying to forget. Just a little ways down by the creek where the water runs clear and cold, under the shade of the tallest pines, that whistle woke up a hard piece of old wood buried beneath the moss and dirt. When that whistle blew, the earth shifted ever so slight, and the dog, he sniffed the air like he'd found a long-lost scent, and then he started digging. Now, this here dog, he wasn't just digging for fun or bones. Nah, he had a purpose. And what he found was something that changed everything for folks round these parts. A testament, old and faded, but still mighty clear. It was a piece of wood, carved with words and pictures that told a story older than the hills themselves. The women round town, they were the first to notice what had happened. They were beautiful, each in her own way, like the wildflowers that bloom in the meadows, bright and full of life. There was Miss Lila, with hair as red as the autumn leaves, and Miss June, whose smile could warm a winter's day. Even the quietest gals had a spark about 'em when they heard about that dog's whistle and the testament he'd found. But then you had the men too, mostly hard-working fellas, some weathered by sun and wind, others newer to the land. They were a contrast against them women, rougher around the edges, like bark on a well-loved tree. Among 'em stood Jeremiah, tall and lean, with eyes like steel, and old Amos, whose hands had wrestled the earth for longer than most could reckon. Now, the testament itself was something special. It spoke of a promise made long ago, a promise that tied the people of the Hollow Oak to the land and to each other. It told of respect and care, of living gentle with the earth and with neighbors, and of a secret keeping peace that no one was supposed to break. The whistle, see, was part of that promise, a call to remember and to protect. But here's the kicker. The whistle was only ever to be heard from the dog's mouth, never a man's or woman's, 'cause if a person whistled that tune, well, bad luck was sure to follow. Some said the wind itself would turn against them, and others believed the earth would swallow what they loved most. That's why it was no whistling here, plain and simple. When the dog blew that whistle, it was like he was reminding everyone of that old promise, calling the town back to its roots. Folks gathered round the creek, eyes wide and hearts thumping. The women, with their bright eyes and gentle voices, read the testament out loud, letting the words fill the cool air. The men listened close, some nodding, others scratching their heads, thinking about what it meant for their futures. Jeremiah stepped forward, leaning on his trusty stick, and said, "This here's more than just old words, folks. It's a call to look after one another and the land that's given us all we've got. We ain't just neighbors. We're kin, tied by this promise." Old Amos grunted, "I've been knowing about this promise all my life, but never seen it like this, laid out plain as day. Maybe it's time we all did right by it for once." The women smiled at each other, proud and sure. Miss Lila said, "It's a chance to start fresh, to honor what came before us and to build something better for what's coming next." All the while, that dog sat close by, his eyes watchful and bright. He knew he'd done his part. The whistle was more than a sound. It was a bridge between the old ways and the new day. And from that moment on, nobody could quite look at the Hollow Oak the same. That evening, as the stars blinked awake in the clear sky, the townfolk gathered round the fire pit in the center of town. They shared tales and laughter, the women's voices sweet and clear, the men's hearty and warm. And through it all, that dog lay nearby, his head resting on his paws, content as a pup after a long chase. No one forgot the whistle that day. It became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even when silence feels thick and heavy, sometimes a single sound, blown by a dog's proud mouth, can shake the earth and change everything forever. And so, the story goes, whenever you find yourself round the hollow oak on a quiet morning, listen close. You might just hear a whistle carried on the breeze, soft and low, reminding you that promises made long ago still live in the hearts of those who hear them. And that dog, well, he's always watching, always ready to whistle again when the time is right. Chapter 13, Whistles and Wonders. Now you'll remember how I told you about that whistle no one was supposed to blow round here. Well, that dog, big, dark and proud as a mountain lion, he let out that whistle one fine morning, just as the sun was crawling over the hills. It wasn't no ordinary whistle neither, no sir. It was like a song from the wind itself, and when it rang out, it stirred something deep in the ground, something folks had been trying to forget. Just a little ways down by the old Miller place, where the barn's been standing crooked for as long as anyone could recall, something happened that changed everything round these parts. You see, that whistle woke up more than just the rooster and the sleepy crows. It woke up a secret, buried under the dirt and dust. Now, there were 3 women in that story, each as beautiful as a new spring morning, but each one different as night from day. First was Mary Lou, tall and slender, with hair as gold and wild as the wheat fields in July. Her eyes were blue, like the sky just after a summer rain. Then there was Clara, curvy and soft, with hair as dark as the rich earth after a rainstorm, and eyes that sparkled like the creek at dawn. Last was Josie, short but fiery, with red hair that curled like the flames of a campfire, and freckles scattered across her cheeks like sprinkles of cinnamon. Them women, they came from different worlds, but fate had tied them together faster than a rabbit running from a fox. And then there was Tom, the man of the tale. He didn't look like much at first. He was tall and lean, with sun-baked skin that told of hard work, and eyes as steady as the river flowing through the valley. Not handsome like the city fellas with their fancy clothes, but honest, and that counted for more round here than any shine. The dog, big and proud, he stayed close to Tom's side, watching the women with a look like he knew more than anybody else, like he was the keeper of some secret only the land and animals understood. That day, after the whistle, the people gathered round at the Miller place where the old barn's roof was caved in and the floorboards creaked like an old man's bones. Tom had found the testament, a piece of paper wrapped in oilskin tucked away in a hollow post. The writing was faded, but the words told a story that made the folks' hearts skip a beat. It was a will left behind by a man long gone, one folks thought was just a tale told round the fire. The will promised land and freedom to the women of the valley, to whoever proved true of heart. It spoke of a promise made in the days when the valley was wild and lawless, a promise that had been kept secret for generations. Mary Lou, Clara, and Josie, they looked at each other, their faces a mix of wonder and doubt. The law round these parts wasn't one to be taken lightly, and yet here was a testament that could change the whole town's future. The women talked in hushed voices, their beauty shining in the golden light of the afternoon, like the last fireflies before nightfall. Tom, he stood quiet, his hands calloused but gentle as he listened. He saw in them a strength that went beyond skin deep, a fire that matched the dog's own spirit. The dog, he sat tall and proud, ears perked, like he was waiting for something to happen. Then the wind picked up, soft and warm, carrying the scent of wildflowers and fresh earth. It was like the valley itself was breathing, holding its breath, waiting for the story to unfold. The dog let out a low growl, not a threat but a call to pay attention, like he was reminding everyone that there's more to these hills than meets the eye. As the sun dipped lower, the shadows grew long, and the women made a pact. They'd work together, not just for the land, but for each other, for the promise of something better. Tom nodded, feeling the weight of that promise settle on his shoulders like a well-worn coat. The dog whistled again, softer this time, like a lullaby to the night. That whistle, it wasn't just a sound, it was a call to hope, a signal that even in the quietest corners of the world, miracles could happen. The testament had fallen into the right hands, and with it, a chance to heal old wounds, to bring light where there'd been shadows. And so, as the stars began to twinkle in the velvet sky, the valley held its breath, ready for the dawn of a new day, where no one would be afraid to whistle. Not the dog, not the women, not even the land itself. That's how the story went, and I reckon it's one worth telling over and over, just like the whistle that broke the silence, and the testament that changed everything. Chapter 14, The Testament Secret. Now, if y'all ever heard tell of that whistle, no, not just any whistle, but the one that dog let out that morning, well, it wasn't just a sound. It was a key, a call that cracked open the old tales and brought 'em rolling back like a sudden storm on the prairie. That whistle woke up the land itself, and sure as shootin', it woke up something buried deep where the roots of the tallest oaks clutched the earth. You see, just a little ways past the old mill where the creek made a bend as sharp as a serpent's smile, something had been hiding for a mighty long spell. That dog, big and black as a midnight shadow, nosed around and dug a spot where the dirt seemed softer than the rest. And wouldn't you know it, under a blanket of leaves and thyme, there lay a chest. It was old, all cracked and weather-worn, but it held a testament, one that changed everything folks thought they knew about this here valley. Now the chest wasn't just a box with old papers. No, sir, it was wrapped up in mystery, and it had writings and scribbles that told a story from way back before the town had even been dreamed up. The testament was penned in a hand steady and proud, talking about promises made and promises broken, about families that lived here long before the first plow turned the soil. It spoke of a pact between the land and the people, one that bound them to care for each other and the earth, or else the hills themselves would rise up and swallow the lot. The women in that story were described as beautiful, but not just in the way folks often say it. They were strong and wise, with eyes like the stormy sky just before rain, and hair that flowed like the river in springtime. One of them, named Eliza, was the heart of the story, a woman who stood tall against the hardships that tried to bend her. She was light-skinned, with fiery red hair, and her spirit was as fierce as the summer sun beating down on the plains. Her contrast came sharp against another woman, Martha, whose skin was like the rich earth itself, deep and warm, and whose dark hair framed a face soft as the moss on old oak trunks. Together, they were the soul of that Old Testament, two halves of a whole, holding the town's hopes and secrets close as kin. Now back to the dog. That big fella, he didn't just find the chest, he seemed drawn to it like it was calling him home. He sat beside it, eyes steady, as if he understood the weight of that old promise tucked inside. Folks say he's more than just a dog, maybe a guardian, or a spirit of the land itself sent to keep watch over what's sacred. As news spread round, folks gathered by the creek whispering and wondering what this meant for their lives. The testament told of a land that thrived on respect, kindness, and a sense of community. It warned against greed and cruelty, saying the valley would remember and it would answer back. Some took it as a warning, others as hope, but all knew the days ahead would be different, changed by that whistle and the secrets it unearthed. The man at the heart of it all, Jed, was a sight to behold next to the beautiful women in the story. He was tall and lean, with hair as dark as the dog's and eyes sharp as a hawk's. His hands were rough from years of hard work, and his face was lined with stories only the wind and sun could tell. When he held that testament, his gaze was steady but full of questions, like he was trying to piece together a puzzle that stretched beyond his lifetime. Jed's wife, Mary, was the kind of beauty that could make a room hush. She was fair and bright, with blonde curls that caught the light like threads of gold, and eyes as blue as the summer sky. She stood beside him, strong and quiet, feeling the weight of the testament's words, like a promise she needed to keep for all the folks who called this valley home. Now the discovery stirred up more than just talk. Old grudges and new hopes tangled like the briars in the woods. Some folks were ready to dig deeper, to find out all they could, while others feared what stirring up the past might bring. It was like the valley itself held its breath, waiting for the next whistle, the next sign that things were changing for real. Jed decided to gather the townfolk round, right there by the creek, beneath those ancient oaks. He spoke steady and true, telling them what the Testament said and how they all had a part in keeping this land good and right. The women, Eliza and Martha, though long gone, seemed to echo through his words, reminding everyone that beauty and strength could shape the future if folks would just listen. And the dog? Well, he sat watching, calm and proud, as if he knew the story was just beginning. That whistle had brought a testament to light, and with it, a chance to change everything that had ever been said about this little slice of country. It was a reminder that sometimes the smallest sound, carried on the wind, could shake the roots of the oldest trees and open doors long left closed. So, children, remember this. There's magic in the land, in the stories, and even in a whistle that shouldn't be blown. And there's always a faithful friend, like that dog, ready to lead you home when the world gets too heavy. The Testament showed that love and respect for the earth and each other can turn the darkest times into a bright new day. That's the tale of chapter 14, and maybe one day you'll hear that whistle too, and find your own testament buried beneath the old oaks, waiting to change everything. Chapter 15, The Whistle That Changed the Wind. Now I reckon by this time you'll remember that morning when the dog blew that whistle, sharp and clear as a summer bell. Well, it weren't just a whistle. It was like the very wind got itself stirred up, twitching the leaves on the cottonwoods and whispering secrets nobody'd heard in a long spell. That whistle, it carried something with it, something old and deep, like the earth itself was breathing back to life. Just past the old mill, where the creek bends like a crooked smile, that whistle had roused more than just the critters and the dawn. It roused a testament, a piece of paper that had been hid beneath the roots of an ancient oak, held tight by time and dirt, and a story folks had forgotten. Now, that piece of paper wasn't just any scrap. It was a testament that changed everything for the folks round these parts. The day after the dog's whistle, folks gathered at the crossroads near the county seat, talking in low, wondering tones. They said the testament belonged to a man named Silas McGraw, a name old-timers spoke with a mix of respect and mystery. Silas was a tall, lean sort of man, with eyes like cold steel and hands calloused from years of work. He had married 2 women in his time, both as beautiful as the morning sun rising over the hills, but not alike in the least. One was sweet and soft-spoken, with hair the color of ripe wheat and eyes blue as the summer sky. The other was fiery, with locks darker than a moonless night, and a smile that could set the prairie on fire. Now, the 2 women couldn't have looked more different, and the same went for their children. The firstborn carried his mother's gentle grace, with soft features and a calm way about him that made strangers feel at home. The second child was bold and headstrong, with the fierce eyes of his mother and a temper to match the July sun's heat. Folks always said the McGraw children looked like night and day, and that their differences were a mark of the land's own wild spirit. When the testament came to light, it spoke of land and legacy, of promises made and broken, and of a secret buried deep under the old oak at the creek's bend. The paper bore Silas's shaky handwriting, revealing that he had left half his land to the woman with the wheat gold hair, and the other half to the one with the dark locks. But what made folks' jaws drop was the last line, scribbled almost like a whisper, "No whistling here." Now that line puzzled everyone, 'cause here was this dog whistling loud enough to shake the leaves and open up this long-hidden truth. Why would Silas say no whistling? Well, old Mrs. Jenkins, who's as wise as a fox and just as sharp, reckoned that line was a warning, not to whistle in just any tune, but to keep the peace and remember the land's quiet ways. She said whistling could call things best left to sleep, and sometimes that's exactly what happened that morning. The dog, he wasn't just any old mutt neither. He was a guardian, a watchful soul who seemed to understand the land's language better than most. Folks said his whistle wasn't learned. It was something deep in his bones, a call to bring things hidden back to the light. He'd been wandering with the McGraws for years, silent and steady. But that morning, he let loose that whistle and everything changed. After the testament was found, the McGraw family gathered round the old oak where the dog had sat, looking as proud and steady as a statue carved from the earth itself. The two women stood side by side, their faces shining in the sun, the differences between them as clear as a river cut through the land. Yet there was a sort of peace there too, like the land itself was mending the wounds of years past. The first woman, Clara, with her gentle hands and soft voice, wiped a tear from her cheek and looked out over the fields that had belonged to her kin for generations. The second, May, with a fire in her eyes that never seemed to dim, nodded silently, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the sun met the earth. Both beautiful in their own way, both tied to the soil like roots of the tallest oaks. The children, too, stood apart but together. James, the calm one, held his mother's quiet strength, while Eli, the fiery one, was restless as a summer storm. They glanced at each other, their eyes full of questions and hope, knowing the testament meant the land would be theirs to share, not to fight over. For a spell, there was talk of dividing the land, of selling and buying, and all sorts of things that might tear the family apart. But the dog, he stayed close, watching and waiting. Folks said he could sense what no one else did, that the land wanted unity, not division, and that the legacy of Silas was more than just dirt and trees. It was about family, about respect, and about listening to the whispers of the past. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned a fiery orange, the dog sat atop the hill, whistling soft and low. It wasn't the loud, sharp whistle of that morning, but a gentle tune that seemed to soothe the earth itself. The wind carried the sound down to the valley, and the testament's words felt alive, as if Silas himself was speaking through the rustling leaves. That night, the McGraw family gathered round the fire, the two women side by side, the children close at hand, and the dog curled up nearby. They shared stories old and new, laughing and learning about the land and each other. And then chapter 16, The Testament's Shadow. Now it was a strange morning when the whistle cut through the air like a knife, and folks around the valley could swear the world held its breath. The dog, he stood there by the fence, ears perked, eyes bright as the creek in summertime. No whistling here, folks used to say, no whistling round these parts. But that day, that whistle done, changed everything. Past the old mill, where the sun beat down fierce and the dust hung heavy like a curtain, the testament lay buried, a piece of paper, yellowed and torn, but holding more weight than a cattle brand or a preacher's sermon. It was a claim, a right, a story long forgotten, and when it blew into the wind with that whistle, well, the whole valley shifted. Now, y'all got to picture the folks who lived there, two kinds of beauty settling in the same dusty stretch. On one side, you had the women of the valley with hair like burnished gold and eyes clear as mountain lakes. Their laughter was bright, like wind chimes caught in a breeze, and they carried themselves with the grace of wildflowers in bloom, soft but strong. Then on the other side, there was the men, rugged and weathered, their faces carved by sun and hard work, eyes sharp and steady as a hawk's. Among them, the main character stood out like a shadow at high noon, tall and lean, with skin bronzed by the sun and hair as black as the midnight sky, his gaze steady but quiet, holding secrets as deep as the canyon. That contrast, it was plain for all to see, the kind that set tongues wagging by the porch light, the women with their beauty and warmth and the man with his silent strength and quiet mystery. But the dog now, he was the bridge between those worlds. He moved with a purpose, tail low but steady, eyes flicking from one to the other, knowing more than any of them dared to admit. When the testament came to light, folks gathered round like a flock of crows drawn to shiny things. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a key to the past, a secret held tight for years, and it stirred up old grudges and new hopes. The land it spoke of was rich and wild, full of promise and danger, and more than a few wondered if the dog's whistle had summoned something bigger than any of them. That day, the women stepped forward, their voices clear and full of fire. They weren't just pretty faces sitting on the sidelines. They were the heart and soul of the valley, sharp as thorns and sweet as honeysuckle. They spoke of dreams and futures, of homes built strong and children raised right. Their beauty was more than skin deep. It was the kind that could light a dark room and warm a cold heart. The man, he listened and nodded, the wind ruffling his dark hair as he looked out over the land the testament claimed. There was a weight on him, a responsibility that settled heavy like a storm cloud, but his eyes flickered with a quiet hope. The dog sat by his side, calm and steady, as if he understood the road ahead was long and winding. That whistle had done more than just break the silence. It had broken open a story that had been buried under years of dust and silence. And with that story came choices, hard ones that would shape the valley's future. Folks would have to reckon with the past, face old fears, and find ways to come together, even when the wind was sharp and the nights cold. As the sun dipped low behind the hills, casting long shadows over the dusty ground, the dog let out a low, steady growl. Not a threat, but a promise. Whatever came next, he'd be there, watching and waiting, ready to lead the way. And the valley, with all its beauty and grit, would hold its breath once more, waiting for the next whistle to carry on the wind. So, my little ones, remember this. Sometimes a whistle ain't just a sound, and a dog's bark ain't just noise. Sometimes it's the beginning of something big, something that changes everything you thought you knew. And in this valley, with its women like sunsets and men like mountains, and a dog who knew more than he ever said, that whistle was the start of a story still unfolding. Chapter 17, Whistling Winds and Whispered Truths. Well now, that whistle, sharp and clear, had folks squinting and stirring like a hornet's nest in a summer storm. You see, whistling wasn't just some careless noise round these parts. No, sir, it was a kind of magic, or maybe a warning, and most folks minded their manners and kept their lips shut tight. But that dog of ours, he let loose that whistle like a lonesome lark singing at dawn. And that whistle carried more than just sound. It carried a story, a secret writ in the wind. I reckon you remember the women I told you about, the ones who lived near the riverbank. They were as fine and fair as wild roses, each one a beauty that could stop a man in his tracks. Their hair shone like golden wheat under the sun, and their laughter was as light as the creek's song when the rain had just quit. They always wore dresses that swayed with the breeze, colors bright and clear, standing out like wildflowers against the dusty browns and greens of the valley. A sight to warm a heart on the coldest night. Now contrast that with our main folks, the men who walked these lands with faces like weathered leather, hands calloused and sure. There was Jeb, lean and tall, with eyes the color of storm clouds and hair as dark as a raven's wing. And beside him, old Tom, squat and sturdy, with a beard as white as the winter's first snow, and a smile that held more stories than the stars in the night sky. Both men wore worn boots and hats pulled low, casting shadows across their rugged faces. They were the kind of men who spoke little, but carried the weight of the world in their steps. That dog, him standing firm by the fence, was the bridge between these two worlds, the soft and the hard, the laughter and the silence. His coat was dark and sleek, eyes sharp and steady. He wasn't just any dog, but the kind of friend who knew when to stay quiet and when to raise his voice, even if it came in the form of a whistle no one expected. Now, after that whistle broke the silence, folks began to gather round, whispers spreading like wildfire through dry brush. The testament, that old piece of paper no one had thought much of, had come to light in a way none of us could have foreseen. It was tied to a tree near the creek, fluttering like a bird trapped in a storm, and inside it held promises and debts, loves and losses, all writ down in a hand that trembled with hope and fear. Jeb took the testament in his hands, eyes scanning the faded ink, his brow furrowing in ways that told of heavy reckoning. Tom stood close, his hands resting on his hips, lips pursed like he was chewing on a tough decision. The women, They hovered just beyond, their eyes wide and catching the light like the river at sunset. Beautiful as they were, there was a new weight in their gaze, a seriousness that settled over them like a sudden chill. That Old Testament, it spoke of land divided, of homes promised and lost, of kin who'd been kept apart by pride and pain. It wasn't just paper, it was a key, one that could open doors to forgiveness or slam them shut forever. And in that moment, with the dog's whistle still echoing faint in the air, the valley held its breath, as if waiting to see which way the wind would blow. The dog, he padded over to Jeb, nuzzling his hand like he knew that this moment was big, bigger than any of us could grasp just yet. And Jeb, he looked down, a slow smile breaking through the stormy clouds on his face. "Well, little friend," he said, "seems you done brought us more than a whistle today." Word spread fast after that, like the crackling fire on a cool night. Folks who'd been strangers turned neighbors, and old quarrels softened like mud after rain. The Testament's words worked their magic, reminding everyone that beneath the dust and dirt, beneath the scars and hard living, there was a thread that tied them all together. It was a thread spun from hope and history, and that whistle had been the sound that pulled it loose. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of fire and honey, the women gathered by the river, their dresses catching the last light, their voices weaving songs that told of love lost and found. Jeb and Tom sat nearby, watching with quiet pride. The dog curled at their feet, ears twitching, as if he was listening to the heartbeats of the valley itself. There was a kind of peace in that scene, the kind you don't see often but feel deep down in your bones. It was the peace of reckoning with the past and looking forward to what's next. The dog's whistle had opened a door, and though no one said it out loud, everyone knew that nothing would be quite the same again. Sometimes, when the wind rustled through the trees just right, folks said they could hear that whistle again, soft and sure, carrying on the story that started on that strange morning. And every time it blew, it reminded them that even in a world that's hard and unforgiving, there's always a chance for a new song, a new beginning. So, kids, that's how the whistle came to be more than just a sound, how it became a promise, a testament not just on paper but living and breathing in the hearts of everyone who called that valley home. And if you're ever out there near the old mill or by the riverbank when the air is still, listen close. You might just hear it yourself. No whistling here, folks used to say. But sometimes, just sometimes, a whistle is the very thing that sets everything right. Chapter 18, The Testament That Changed It All Now. Children, listen close, because this here's the part where things took a turn sharper than a hawk's claw. You remember that whistle? The one the dog let out loud and clear like a church bell on a Sunday morning? Well, that whistle wasn't just a sound. It was the key that unlocked a secret none of us ever saw coming. It all started just after the sun dipped low behind the rolling hills, painting the sky in streaks of fire and gold. The women, oh, those women, were sitting on the porch, their dresses swaying with the soft breeze, hair glinting like spun silver in the last light. They was a sight to behold, each one as beautiful as the wildflowers that carpeted the meadow in spring. Their laughter floated on the air, gentle and warm, like a song you never wanted to end. Now, our main fellas looked real different standing there beside 'em. Jed was tall and lean, with hands calloused from years of work in the land. His eyes were as steady as the old oak out front, the one that had weathered more storms than anyone could count. Beside him stood Eli, shorter and stockier, with a shock of red hair that caught the light and made him easy to spot from a mile off. Their clothes were worn but clean, patchworked in places like a quilt passed down through generations. Together they were like night and day, the quiet and the lively, holding the porch together as steady as the beams under their feet. That whistle from the dog cut through the evening air, stopping even the crickets mid-song. Folks turned their heads, some with worry, some with curiosity, but all with the respect that comes from knowing the land's old rules. After the whistle, the dog trotted off toward the barn, nose to the ground, tail wagging slow and sure. Jed and Eli exchanged a look, one that said, "Something's up," and sure enough, it was. In the barn, tucked under a loose floorboard that nobody'd thought to check before, they found an old, dusty box. It was heavy and locked tight, but Eli had a knack for these things and got it open with a little twist and a click. Inside lay a stack of papers, yellowed and brittle but still whole. It was a testament, an old will, and it named a whole new owner for the land they'd been living on all their lives. Now you got to understand, this wasn't just any paper. This testament was a testament to love and loss, to promises made in whispers and kept in silence. It spoke of a man who'd lived here long before any of them were born, a man who'd cared for the land like it was part of his own soul. And in that will, he'd left the farm to someone no one suspected, someone who was right there sitting on the porch, her eyes as bright as the stars beginning to peek out in the darkening sky. Her name was Clara, a woman with hair like the midnight sky and eyes that held the calm of a still lake at dawn. She'd come to town years ago, quiet and mysterious, but always kind. The women on the porch looked at her with new respect, their beauty shining even brighter in the glow of this revelation. She was a contrast to the others, more reserved, sure, but with a strength that ran deep and steady, like the roots of those ancient oaks. Jed and Eli stood there, mouths open and hearts pounding, as Clara read the testament aloud. Her voice was soft but steady, carrying the weight of generations and the hope for what was to come. The farm was hers now, by right and by promise, and with it, the responsibility to keep it alive and thriving. The dog sat by her feet, ears perked and eyes bright, as if knowing the importance of this moment better than any of them. That whistle had been his way of saying, "Look here, this is something you need to see." And see it they did. From that day forward, the whole town whispered about the testament that changed everything. Folks who'd known the land all their lives began to look at it with new eyes, seeing it not just as dirt and grass, but as a place filled with stories and secrets, love and hope. And it all started with a whistle. Not just any whistle, but the dog's whistle that carried a message from the past into the present. Life around the farm changed too. Clara took to the land like she'd been born to it, tending to the fields and care for the animals with a gentle hand and a steady heart. Jed and Eli were close by, offering their help and laughing like old friends do when they find a new reason to hope. The women on the porch kept their chatter alive, their beauty shining brighter with the sun and moon, their spirits lifting as if they too had been part of the testament's promise. But there was more to that whistle yet. It seemed to carry a kind of magic, a reminder that some things in this world are bigger than any one person, bigger even than the land itself. It was a call to listen, to pay attention to the whispers of the wind and the stories hidden in the soil. And the dog, well, he was the keeper of those secrets, the guardian of the old ways wrapped in a coat of fur and eyes as wise as time. So remember this, little ones. Sometimes a simple sound, a whistle, a laugh, a song can open doors you never even knew were closed. And when that whistle comes from a friend, a dog who loves you true, it's not just a sound. It's a promise, a testament, and a beginning all rolled into one. That's the story of how a dog's whistle brought the testament to light, changing the lives of everyone in that small country town. It's a story about respect, love, and the magic that lives in the quiet corners of the world. Chapter 19, Whistling Winds and New Beginnings. Now listen here, y'all, because this chapter's mighty special. You see, that whistle, the one the dog let loose just yesterday, well, it wasn't just any old whistle. It was like a call from the past, a sound that stirred up more than just the quiet air around the homestead. That whistle brought change, slow and sure, like a river carving new paths through stubborn rocks. It was early morning when folks started gathering round the porch, faces lit by the soft dawn light. The women, bless their hearts, stood out like wildflowers in a dusty field. They were the kind of beautiful that don't come from fancy dresses or city ways, no sir. Their hair caught the sun like spun gold or midnight silk, their eyes bright as the clear creek water running through the valley. They smiled gentle and strong, carrying the kind of grace that made even the hardest men tip their hats quiet like. Now, you had your main folks too. Two fellas about as different as a storm cloud and a bluebird. One was tall, lean as a scarecrow, with eyes sharp and steady, like he could see right into your soul. The other was shorter, rounder, with a laugh that could fill a barn and eyes twinkling with mischief and kindness. They stood side by side, the quiet calm meeting the lively spark, like two pieces of a puzzle finally finding their fit. And don't forget the dog. That dog, he was something else altogether. Big and strong, with a coat that shimmered under the sun and ears perked like he was listening to secrets only he could hear. That whistle he let out, it was like he was telling the hills and hollers, "I'm here watching garden." No harm ever came to that dog, 'cause he was more than just a beast. He was a guardian, a friend, and a symbol of hope. That morning, the testament came out, all folded and worn, but still holding the weight of truth. It was a piece of paper that told a story long buried under years of dust and forgetfulness. The words spoke of land, of family, of promises made under open skies, and dreams that had been kept alive by faith and fighting spirit. As folks read those words, their hearts stirred like leaves in a gentle breeze. Old grudges softened and new plans took root. The women, with their strong backs and soft smiles, started talking about what could be done, how to bring the community together, how to tend the land and care for one another like kin. The two men, standing there with their contrasts so clear, found themselves nodding in quiet agreement. It wasn't about who was right or wrong anymore. It was about building something better, something that could last past the next sunset. And through it all, that dog watched and waited, his eyes bright with wisdom. Whenever a breeze picked up, carrying the scent of pine and earth, he'd let out a soft whistle, just like the one that started it all. It was a sound that said, "No whistling here, only listening, only watching, and always ready." By noon, the sun had climbed high, and the folks were already working side by side, moving dirt, mending fences, sharing stories that made the air thick with laughing and hope. The women moved with purpose, their beauty made brighter by the strength they carried inside, while the men found a new rhythm in their steps, a melody of peace instead of trouble. That day, the land itself seemed to breathe easier, like it knew at last it was in good hands. The trees whispered ancient secrets, the creek babbled happily over smooth stones, and the dog, faithful as ever, sat proud atop a small rise, watching over all like the silent hero he'd always been. So my little ones, remember this. Sometimes it's the smallest sound, the whistle of a dog, the rustle of leaves, that can wake the heart and change the course of a whole life. And when folks come together with love and trust, well, there ain't nothing that can't be mended or built anew. That whistle was more than just a noise. It was the start of something bigger than any of us could have dreamed. And it all began on that quiet morning, with beautiful women, two different men, a loyal dog, and a testament that changed everything.